My name is Evan Winters, and I was 25 years old when it happened in the remote forests near Lake Shasta in Northern California. I can still taste the metallic fear on my tongue whenever I recall those nights. Nights that stripped away every bit of confidence I thought I had. Let me take you back to how it began, before the screams, the blood, and the desperation. I had always considered myself an outdoors enthusiast, although in retrospect, I was more of a day hiker than a true survivalist. My best friends, Olivia Carter, 24, and Tyler Kim, 26, were the real motivators behind our plan to spend a week off the grid near Lake Shasta. We had scoured maps for hidden paths, choosing a rugged backcountry region away from the touristy marinas. Our goal was to film episodes for our newly started travel vlog, Hidden Trails, and show that California wasn't just beaches and theme parks. It was also wild forests, raw and untamed. On a Friday morning, we piled into Tyler's SUV with enough supplies to last 6 or 7 days. The plan was simple: drive until the paved roads disappeared, navigate a few more miles on dusty tracks, and set up a base camp near an isolated ridge overlooking the lake. We would hike, fish, and gather enough footage for at least 3 or 4 vlog episodes. Tyler was the one who pitched the idea. He was calm under pressure, always sure of himself. Olivia, equally adventurous, managed our route using topographic maps and kept us all organized. I was the self-described excitable one, prone to imagining worst-case scenarios. But even my imagination couldn't have conjured what we found out there. The first day felt like any other camping trip. We found a decent spot amid towering pines and set up 2 tents, one for Tyler and me, one for Olivia. The lake shimmered not far below us, and the serenity lulled us into believing we'd discovered paradise. I filmed everything. Us pitching tents, Tyler joking around, Olivia meticulously checking her gear. We were so absorbed in capturing the perfect angle that we didn't notice the sky turning a bruised gray until we heard the crack of distant thunder. A sudden thunderstorm forced us to huddle under a tarp, and we laughed as the wind battered our makeshift shelter. It felt exhilarating, that sense of being at the mercy of nature. When the storm passed, though, we discovered it had fried part of our GPS device. We'd left it hooked up to a cheap solar charger. The display wouldn't turn on anymore, no matter what we tried. Olivia frowned and said she'd rely on the paper maps instead. "Not a big deal," Tyler said confidently. "We'll just navigate by the old-school method. Nothing's going to happen." I nodded, though a knot of unease began to form in my gut. The sky, now clear, still seemed ominous, like it held a secret we weren't meant to learn. That evening, we took a short hike to scout a few vantage points for filming. The woods were dense, the pines tightly packed, and the needle-strewn ground muffled our footsteps. We kept walking, and after about 20 minutes, Olivia stopped so abruptly that I nearly ran into her. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. A nauseating odor drifted through the trees, something rancid and sour. We followed it until we stumbled upon a crude clearing. In its center stood a primitive altar fashioned from piled rocks and planks of rotting wood. Animal bones littered the ground, and half-burned candles surrounded a tattered cloth smeared with what looked like dried blood. "What the hell?" Tyler muttered, running his hand through his hair. The place felt wrong, as if we'd trespassed on a forbidden site. My chest tightened. Part of me wanted to document everything for our vlog, but my instincts screamed to leave. In that moment, I realized the forest was completely quiet. No insects buzzing, no distant birds calling. The silence pressed in on us. Olivia frowned. "This is messed up. We should get back before dark." We hurried away, turning every so often to see if anyone was behind us. I could almost sense eyes watching us through the pines, but I saw no movement. By the time we returned to camp, the sun had nearly set, the last rays painting the horizon in dull gold and purple. Despite the eerie discovery, we reasoned it could have been some leftover hunting ritual, or even a macabre prank. We tried to laugh it off, though none of us felt genuinely amused. The next day, we woke to a piercingly bright morning. Tyler wanted to capture shots of the lake at dawn, so we split up. He headed along the ridge, camera in hand, while Olivia and I prepared breakfast. The hours rolled by without Tyler's return. Olivia tried not to show her concern, but by mid-afternoon we were both worried. We decided to look for him, though we weren't sure which direction he'd gone after filming. Sticking together, we hiked around the area, calling his name. The knots in my stomach tightened each time I heard no response. Just before dusk, as we circled back toward our camp, we finally spotted his camera bag torn open in the brush. The camera inside was gone, and the bag's strap looked cut rather than broken. Something in me snapped. "Tyler!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "Tyler, can you hear me?" Only silence answered. Back at camp, we tried to strategize. Maybe Tyler had gotten disoriented or injured, but a deep-seated fear told me something more sinister had happened. Olivia insisted we do a broader search early the next morning. We still had no functioning GPS, and after the storm, our phone reception was non-existent. That night, we took shifts staying awake. Neither of us spoke much, but I could tell Olivia fought the same creeping dread. When dawn broke, we packed essentials and ventured inland. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, pines and thick undergrowth disorienting us. Around midday, we stumbled on a dirt path that branched off toward a rusted sign, the letters weathered beyond recognition. Farther along, we spotted a small structure, an old cabin, or maybe a caretaker's shack. It was a rundown place with boarded windows and a sagging roof. Olivia called out a greeting. An older man, with wiry gray hair and a rifle slung over his shoulder, appeared from around the corner. He eyed us suspiciously. "What brings you here?" he asked. His voice carried an odd mix of caution and hostility. "We're looking for our friend," Olivia said. "He disappeared yesterday. Have you seen anyone around here?" The man glanced at me, then back at Olivia. "Folks go missing around here sometimes," he said grimly. "You two best get yourselves gone. This land isn't safe." He refused to say more, just repeated that we should leave. Eventually, he hoisted his rifle and stalked away into the trees. There was something about his expression that unsettled me, like he knew more than he was willing to admit. We left the shack, forging deeper into the woods, hoping to find any trace of Tyler. Hours passed, and the day grew hot. The only thing that kept me going was the gnawing desire to find him. Then, in a patch of ferns near a narrow game trail, we found another clue. Tyler's baseball cap, spattered with mud. It looked as if it had been dropped in a struggle. I picked it up, hands trembling. "He was here," Olivia whispered, her face pale. "We can't stop now." We pushed on. The trees thickened, weaving into a sun-blocking canopy. My pulse jackhammered in my ears, and I realized I hadn't drunk water in hours. The entire forest felt oppressive, as if it resented our presence. Then we heard a distant cry, echoing through the pines. "Evan! Olivia!" The voice was faint, muffled, but unmistakably Tyler's. We ran toward the sound, adrenaline surging. Deeper and deeper we went, the cry coming again, clearer. It led us to a cluster of ramshackle cabins in a small hollow we hadn't noticed before. Smoke curled from one cabin's chimney, and parked outside were two battered pickup trucks with no license plates. An old wooden gate circled the perimeter, decorated with more of those strange symbols we'd seen on the altar. We ducked behind a fallen log, scanning the area. Then we saw a figure drag Tyler out of one cabin. He stumbled, his hands bound. His clothes were torn, and bruises marred his arms. My stomach roiled with anger and relief. He was alive, but clearly in danger. Olivia grabbed my arm, her eyes fierce. "We need a plan." Before we could form one, a second captor emerged. Dressed in dirty overalls, the man held a shotgun. He prodded Tyler in the back, forcing him toward another cabin. Tyler cast a glance at the woods, as if sensing us, but said nothing. My heart felt like it might burst from my chest. Olivia and I carefully circled the compound, trying to stay out of sight. We found a window at the rear of the second cabin, its frame rotting. Inside, silhouettes moved in the half-light. We heard murmured voices and occasionally a soft moan of pain, Tyler's voice. Anger flooded me. Inching close, we risked a peek through a gap in the boards. Tyler sat tied to a chair, head lolling forward. A single overhead bulb illuminated a space that resembled a workshop turned nightmare. Rusty blades and half-scorched tools lay scattered across a table. The walls bore dark stains. It looked like these people had done this before, and not just once. One of the captors turned to a robed figure in the corner. We found him sneaking by the ridge. Could be more out there. "That caretaker was supposed to keep them away," the robed figure muttered. "We'll deal with it tonight." My pulse thundered. So that old man might have guided them somehow, or at least covered for them. I felt Olivia's nails dig into my wrist, urging me away from the window. We needed to find a way to free Tyler and escape. We crept around the side of the cabin. The door was thick, but the walls were flimsy. Olivia gestured for me to follow her to a storage shed off to the side. Inside, we found crates of canned food, tarps, and some rope, but no obvious weapons besides a rusted hatchet. Even that was better than nothing. I clutched the hatchet tightly, my heart pounding as I tried not to imagine the worst. We heard raised voices. Footsteps crunched outside as two more robed figures stepped into view, carrying lanterns. They walked toward a nearby fire pit, where an iron cauldron stood. I forced myself not to think about what it might contain. The smell drifting from that area made me gag, putrid, sweet, and nauseating all at once. Olivia motioned for me to be quiet. We slipped out the back of the shed, inching toward the main cabin again. Through another gap, we saw a horrifying sight. Tyler was laid out on a table now, arms bound behind him. A robed figure prodded him with something metal, and Tyler moaned through clenched teeth. My body trembled with rage. If we didn't act soon, I was certain they'd kill him. Or worse. Olivia mouthed, "Now!" and we lunged for the door. She kicked it with surprising force, snapping the rotted frame. We rushed inside before the cultists could react. The one nearest to Tyler brandished a knife. Without thinking, I swung the hatchet at his arm, hearing a sickening crack. He screamed, dropping the blade. My own stomach churned at the violence, but adrenaline and panic drove me. Olivia grabbed Tyler, trying to undo his bonds. Another cultist tackled her, and they crashed to the floor. I turned to help, but the robed figure I'd struck was still on his feet, shrieking in pain. He lunged at me with his good arm, grappling for my throat. We stumbled into a table, sending metal instruments clattering to the ground. I felt a blade slice my shoulder. White-hot pain flared, but I managed to push him away and deliver a desperate blow with the hatchet's handle. He fell, howling. Nearby, Olivia wrestled with the second attacker. She twisted, knocking the robed figure's head against the floor. The man went limp. Tyler, half conscious, fell off the table, narrowly missing the cluster of knives. Blood trickled down his temple, but I couldn't tell if it was new or old. Olivia pulled him upright. "We have to go," she shouted. We fled through the cabin door into the gathering dusk. The commotion had drawn more members of the cult. At least 3 more robed figures and a man with a shotgun. Firelight flickered as they spotted us, raising an alarmed cry. "There! Stop them!" Bullets whizzed overhead, splintering tree trunks. Tyler sagged between us, barely able to stand. I fought a rising wave of panic. We dodged behind one of the pickup trucks, hearts hammering. I checked Tyler's pulse. It was rapid but steady. Olivia scrambled to the driver's door, locked. One of the cultists rounded the corner of the cabin, eyes wild. He raised a pistol. I acted on a primal instinct and swung the hatchet. He fired, grazing my leg, but I didn't feel it until later. The man collapsed, howling in pain, and the pistol skittered across the ground. Olivia scooped it up, brandishing it with shaking hands. We half-dragged Tyler past the vehicles, away from the roaring flames of the fire pit. More shouts filled the night, anger, confusion, and the bleating of some distant horn or whistle. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to keep going. We crashed into the thick pines, their needles scattering beneath our feet. A ferocious downpour started again as if the storm clouds had followed us. Lightning flickered, illuminating the forest in ghostly flashes. Muddied and exhausted, we pressed forward, only dimly aware of the pounding footsteps behind us. At one point, a lightning strike hit a massive pine several yards away, splitting the trunk. Fire sparked amid the branches, lighting up the darkness like a hellish beacon. We used that chaotic glow to guide us through the underbrush. The cultists' yells grew more distant, drowned by thunder. Eventually, we found a narrow deer trail hugging a steep embankment. Tyler, delirious, stumbled, nearly plunging over the edge. Olivia and I caught him just in time, straining to pull him back onto the trail. Hours seemed to blur together as we staggered through the storm. My shoulder burned, my leg throbbed, and my mind buzzed with images of the gore-stained cabin and the robed figures. We dared not stop. Survival drove us on, half carrying Tyler over rocks and roots until the forest began to thin. Sometime near dawn, we reached a deserted logging road, its ruts filled with rainwater. Relief washed over me. A path, man-made, meant civilization. Somewhere. We collapsed there on the roadside, shivering in the cold. I checked Tyler's breathing. It was shallow but even. Olivia pressed a soaked bandage against the gash on my shoulder. Fatigue weighed on us, but we didn't dare sleep. I feared the cult might still be behind us, creeping silently through the pines. Shortly after sunrise, by some stroke of luck, headlights appeared in the distance. A battered old pickup rattled toward us. I forced myself to stand and wave frantically. The driver slowed, a bewildered expression on his face when he saw 3 haggard strangers caked in mud and blood. "Help us," Olivia croaked, her voice raw. "Please." He opened the passenger door, glancing around nervously as if expecting an ambush. We piled in, Tyler slumping against me. Our rescuer introduced himself only as Walt, a local who'd been out checking storm damage. He didn't ask too many questions, only listened with growing horror as we described some version of what we'd endured. We left out the finer details, but even the hints were enough to widen his eyes. Walt drove us straight to a small medical clinic near the outskirts of a town. Tyler was whisked into the back for immediate care. Nurses bandaged my wounds and gave Olivia warm blankets. When the police came, we provided a shaky account. Yes, we'd been camping. Yes, Tyler was kidnapped. Yes, we were attacked by multiple assailants. But when pressed for specifics about robed figures, cannibal altars, or a hidden compound, our words sounded unbelievable, even to our own ears. We led officers back to the approximate location as best we could, but the storm and our frantic escape had left us disoriented. Search teams scoured the area for days and reportedly found only charred timber, remnants of what might have been the cabins. Officials discovered no bodies, no proof of who had inhabited the site, and no sign of the caretaker's shack. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything whole. Tyler spent a week in the hospital, recovering from broken ribs, a concussion, and horrific bruises. Olivia and I stayed by his side, haunted by the memory of the howls in the night and the robed figures with deadened eyes. We tried to put the pieces together. Why us? How many victims came before? But we got no concrete answers. Every so often, one of us would mention the caretaker, how he'd warned us to leave, how he might have been complicit. But we never found him again, and the police had no records matching our descriptions. Even now, I dream of that lightning-scorched pine, of the sizzling air, and the shadowy faces chanting in the firelight. My mind replays the moment we burst into that cabin to save Tyler, the primal terror, the desperation to survive at any cost. Whatever that cult was, they vanished like smoke, leaving us with nothing but scars and nightmares. I haven't told the full story publicly. In fact, none of us have posted a single clip from that trip, though I know the camera footage is out there, lost in the forest or destroyed in that final chaotic night. Maybe it's better that way. Some horrors aren't meant to be shared, and some corners of the world aren't meant for travelers like us. If you ever find yourself in the remote reaches near Lake Shasta, remember my story. Be wary of deserted paths and strange altars. If you sense something watching, turn around. Go home. Because if you keep going, like we did, you might discover that the wild places sometimes hide real monsters, and you might not be lucky enough to make it out alive. My name is Cynthia Parker, and I was 42 years old when I first encountered the thing in the Mojave National Preserve. I had been on the road for 2 months at that point, traveling solo in my RV, trying to clear my head after losing my husband in a car accident the year before. Grief had become an unwelcome passenger on this journey, but I was determined to find some semblance of peace, or at least distraction, in the solitude of the desert. I arrived at the preserve on a blisteringly hot afternoon. Waves of heat shimmered off the asphalt as I navigated the lonely highway. My RV rattled over potholes until the road narrowed into gravel. Dust clouds formed behind me, trailing like ghosts. When I found an unmarked turnout, I steered onto the hard-packed sand and parked. This wasn't an official campground, but I didn't mind. I wanted space to breathe, away from curious eyes or idle chatter. Once I cut the engine, the silence pressed in. No hum of air conditioning or distant traffic, just the scorching hush of the Mojave. My eyes swept across the landscape. Distant rock formations, scattered Joshua trees, and endless stretches of golden sand. It felt freeing and daunting at the same time. I spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, unfurled my awning, hauled out a folding chair, and sipped tepid water from a canteen. Late in the day, as the sun sank low, I grabbed my camera to capture the glow dancing on the rocks. Everything looked otherworldly in that golden hour light. The desert was harsh, but it had a certain beauty that captivated me. I was so lost in wonder that the first sign almost escaped my notice. While panning my camera around, I caught movement near a group of boulders about 100 yards away. The shape darted behind a large rock, so quickly I nearly convinced myself it was a trick of the failing light. But the shape had looked eerily familiar, like a woman wearing the same faded turquoise shirt I wore. I lowered my camera, heart pounding. The boulders now stood inert and lifeless. I stayed there for a moment, waiting, but nothing else moved. I blamed my nerves, or the brightness playing havoc with my vision. Deciding I was just tired, I returned to my RV and tried to shake off the feeling that something had watched me. Nightfall brought a drop in temperature, but no comfort. The wind whistled around the RV, rattling the windows. I stoked a small campfire and listened to the soft crackling of burning mesquite. That's when I heard it. My own voice calling me from the darkness. Cynthia. It was just one word, nothing more, spoken in a perfect replica of my tone. My scalp prickled. I stood abruptly, nearly tipping over my camp chair. In the dancing firelight, I peered into the gloom. "Hello?" I called, absurdly replying to what might have been an echo. Silence. My rational mind offered explanations. Maybe I'd heard the wind or a distant coyote. Yet it had sounded so human, so exact. I slept poorly that night, jolting awake at the slightest noise. Each time the desert outside was empty. The next morning, in need of a break from my anxiety, I drove to a small visitor center for water and ice. That's where I met Park Ranger Dale Harris, a tall, stoop-shouldered man in his early 50s. He greeted me politely, his weathered features softening when I mentioned I was new to the area. "You camping alone out here?" he asked. "Yes, I needed some space," I replied, unsure how much to reveal. Ranger Harris nodded. "You should know, cell service is spotty. People get turned around out there more often than you'd think, and the desert can play tricks on you." His words resonated uncomfortably. "What kind of tricks?" He shrugged. "You might hear things, see things. Some folks say spirits roam these sands. Others blame the heat, the wind. Just be careful." I forced a smile, thanked him for his advice, and returned to my RV. His vague warning lingered in my thoughts. I told myself the odd voice last night had been a combination of exhaustion and imagination. Still, I felt uneasy. Later that afternoon, while topping off water at an old spigot, I crossed paths with a solitary man named Greg Yates. He was refilling metal jugs, his clothes sun-bleached and tattered as if he'd lived under the desert sun for years. We exchanged nods, and he mentioned that he lived off-grid nearby. I asked hesitantly, "Ever hear strange voices at night?" He froze mid-pump. "Voices? You might be hearing the wind or maybe coyotes." He paused, then added quietly, "Or maybe you've seen it. The desert reflection." My eyes narrowed. "Desert reflection?" He glanced around as if worried someone might overhear. "There's talk of a spirit that mimics whoever it chooses, steals their voice, face, memories. Usually goes after folks who travel alone. Watch for reflections that don't follow your moves." A chill snaked through me. "Is this a local legend?" Greg shrugged. "Call it what you want." He packed his jugs and left, boots crunching on the grit. I tried to dismiss his words as superstition, but deep down, I couldn't ignore how they lined up with last night's incident. Part of me wanted to drive out of the Mojave and never look back. But leaving felt like I'd be running away. Something I'd done too often since my husband's death. I decided to stay, albeit more cautiously. That evening, back at my makeshift campsite, I paid closer attention to every sound. The desert was never silent. It breathed and shifted in subtle ways. As twilight dimmed the sky, I decided to take a short walk, just to confront my fears. The air cooled rapidly, and I clutched a flashlight, scanning the rocky terrain around me. About 50 yards from my RV, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Footprints that matched the size and tread of my own boots. They meandered in a wide loop before doubling back near my tire tracks. My pulse kicked up a notch. I'd only walked straight out here, so why did these footprints swirl around as if pacing? Suddenly, a flicker of movement near a Joshua tree made me whip around. My flashlight swept across a figure, my figure, standing just beyond the tree's spiky arms. I froze, disbelieving. It wore my same jeans, my same jacket, but the face was hidden in shadow. I drew in a ragged breath and my flashlight flickered. Then the figure took a step toward me, and I glimpsed my own face staring back, eyes vacant and cold. A primal fear seized me. I scrambled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure vanished behind the tree in a blur. My knees buckled, and I stumbled back to the RV, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I stood there, chest heaving. My reflection in the window looked terrified, yet I realized I was checking my own movements, making sure I was still me. I huddled in the driver's seat, mind racing with questions. Was I hallucinating? Was this truly a spirit or doppelganger? My body shook with leftover adrenaline, and I decided I would leave first thing in the morning. Staying here alone was no longer worth the risk. But come morning, the RV's engine refused to start. I turned the key, hearing only clicking sounds. My battery was fine. I'd checked it the previous day, so I couldn't understand the sudden failure. I popped the hood and attempted basic troubleshooting, but nothing worked. I stepped outside, scanning the horizon for help. Dry, cracked earth stretched in every direction. No vehicles, no people. Frustration twisted in my gut. Without cell reception, I was stuck until someone happened to drive by. Meanwhile, that thing, whatever it was, might still be out there. Around midday, I spotted a dusty Jeep approaching in the distance. Relief coursed through me, and I waved it down. The driver was Ranger Harris again. I explained my engine trouble, keeping my voice steady, though my nerves were raw. He took a look under the hood, frowning. Looks like some wires had been tampered with, chewed maybe. He didn't sound convinced it was an animal. Let me radio a tow truck. My heartbeat thundered. Someone or something had sabotaged my RV. While waiting for the radio call to go through, I mustered the courage to tell him about the figure I saw. He listened carefully, his expression guarded. People talk about a shape-shifting spirit in these parts, he said softly. I've never seen it, but enough folks claim they have. It looked like me, I whispered. Ranger Harris tried to reassure me. Once the tow arrives, you can get this fixed in Baker or Barstow, then be on your way. His kind tone couldn't mask his unease. He promised to swing by again after finishing his patrol, then drove off to check another distant station. I sat in the stifling RV, windows open for a breeze, clinging to the promise that help would arrive soon. But the tow truck never came. By sunset, I realized how precarious my situation was. If sabotage was involved, it meant the entity, or whoever controlled it, wanted me stranded. I felt its presence, even if I couldn't see it. My attempts to keep the lights on inside the RV were thwarted by random power surges, as though something was draining the battery. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. Desperate, I grabbed a backpack of essentials, flashlight, water, a knife I kept for emergencies, and started walking toward the main road. Perhaps I could flag down a passing car. The desert twilight painted the sky in ribbons of pink and orange, offering a momentary sense of beauty that clashed with my growing fear. I picked my way across uneven terrain, my boots sliding on loose gravel. Every so often I checked over my shoulder, terrified of glimpsing my own face chasing after me. After half an hour, I found an old, abandoned shack perched on a slight rise. The walls, riddled with holes, still offered more shelter than the open desert. I entered cautiously, shining my flashlight inside. Amid piles of debris, I saw a ragged sleeping bag and a few empty cans, signs of a recent occupant. Then, to my surprise, Greg Yates emerged from a dark corner, a startled look on his sun-etched face. My heart leapt, though relief quickly morphed into suspicion. "Greg, what are you doing here?" He gave me a measured look, one hand hovering near a belt knife. "I live out here," he said simply. "You shouldn't be wandering around at night." I told him about the RV sabotage, the missing tow truck, the figure that looked like me. He nodded grimly, stepping outside to scan the horizon. "That reflection spirit has been active lately," he muttered. "Some folks vanish, never found." A shiver traveled up my spine. I have nowhere else to go tonight. He motioned for me to follow him inside. "We'll keep the lantern lit, see if it stays away, but it doesn't like to give up once it picks a target. Best steal yourself." Greg lit a small lantern, casting flickering light across the shack's warped walls. He explained in hushed tones that legend said the creature thrived on fear and emotional trauma, things that made a person vulnerable. That struck me hard. I was still grieving my husband, still wrestling with guilt over the accident. My grief made me a beacon for this thing. We heard a faint crunch of sand outside. Greg grabbed his knife. I clutched my own. The lantern flickered, and in that wavering glow, the shack's walls seemed to shrink, pressing us together. My lungs constricted in panic. Another sound, footsteps, heavier now, circled the shack. Then, from the broken doorway, we saw a silhouette step into view, half illuminated by moonlight. It wore my face, but the expression twisted into a cruel mockery of my usual features. "Cynthia," it said in my exact voice, "why did you leave me to die?" My throat constricted. Flashes of the car accident jolted through my mind, my husband's hand slipping from mine, the screech of tires. I'd carried guilt for surviving when he didn't. This creature exploited that memory now, using my voice to fling accusations at me. It took a step closer. Greg lunged, knife raised, but the creature ducked out of reach impossibly fast. Moonlight spilled into the shack, and the entity glided around us like a predator teasing its prey. Greg's lantern sputtered, then died. Darkness enveloped us. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I flicked it on, the beam caught the creature mid-leap. It recoiled, hissing, face distorting into a featureless mask before snapping back to my likeness. "Don't listen to it," Greg shouted. "It'll twist your pain." But I was already trembling. The creature stared at me with cold eyes, lips curled in a sneer. "You should have been the one to die," it hissed, echoing my deepest self-blame. It knew exactly where to strike my heart. Tears burned my eyes. I aimed the flashlight wildly, trying to hold it at bay. Greg rushed forward, knife swinging. But the creature vanished into a shadowed corner, its movements eerily silent. Then it appeared behind Greg, slamming him against a broken shelf. Greg gasped, collapsing, blood staining his shirt. Terror flared inside me. But something else rose up too. Anger. I refused to lose another person to a senseless tragedy, supernatural or otherwise. I darted to Greg's side, hauling him back to a more defensible corner. My flashlight caught a dusty hand mirror lying amid the clutter, probably left behind by a former occupant. I snatched it, recalling Greg's earlier warning about reflections. The creature advanced again, shifting from my face to a blank visage and back again. Its shape flickered in the moonlight, as if unstable. Summoning every ounce of determination, I held the mirror up, angle aimed at the creature. The reflection that appeared was hideous, a half-formed mockery of me, features sliding out of place. It let out a piercing shriek, stumbling backward. I followed, refusing to let it escape my beam of light and the mirror's reflection. The doppelganger writhed, then bolted out the doorway into the desert night. Panting hard, I knelt next to Greg. He was wounded, but conscious. We stayed alert for what felt like hours, but the creature didn't return. By the faint glow of dawn, we made our way to a rough dirt road that Greg insisted led to a nearby ranger station. He limped heavily, and I supported him with one arm, clutching that mirror like a talisman in my free hand. Every rustle of brush made my pulse spike. but the desert remained eerily calm. At last, we reached the station, a modest building near a gravel lot. Ranger Harris had just arrived to start his shift. One look at our haggard faces, Greg's injury, and the weapons in our hands told him enough. He ushered us inside, promising to get medical help. I sank onto a wooden chair, tears threatening to spill. We were alive. That thought alone felt surreal. After a medic tended to Greg, Ranger Harris offered to drive me back to my RV. In the early morning sunlight, the sabotage under my hood became clear. Wires snipped in a methodical pattern. No random chew marks. Whether the creature or a human accomplice had done it, I had no answer. The ranger arranged a mechanic to come out from Baker. This time, the tow actually arrived. By midday, I stood by my RV feeling torn between relief and lingering dread. Greg, still shaken and injured, decided to relocate, saying he would stay at a friend's place in a nearby town. He insisted the Mojave had changed after this incident. I believed him. As for me, I chose to leave. I needed to keep moving, find a safe space to nurse my emotional wounds. I had no illusions that driving away meant I was fully free of the creature's memory, but I hoped to outrun the darkest shadows it had cast on my psyche. In the following weeks, I couldn't shake the sense that it still lurked somewhere behind each desert horizon, an echo of my grief, a twisted reflection waiting to pounce if I ever let my guard down. Yet, strangely, I also felt stronger. I had faced something profoundly terrifying, something that forced me to confront my guilt head-on. I would never forget the image of that distorted face mimicking my own. But in surviving it, I realized my grief could no longer hold me captive. I had walked through fear and lived. Even now, I sometimes check my mirror more carefully than I should, half expecting to see my features warp into that mocking grin. And though I've traveled far from the Mojave, I can still feel the hush of the desert sometimes at night. The hush that reminds me of how fragile identity can be when confronted by the darkest parts of ourselves. If you ever venture into those remote sands alone, keep an eye on your reflection. You never know what might be staring back at you. My name is Julian Ramirez, and I was 34 years old when it all happened in the remote edges of the Modok National Forest in Northern California. At the time, I was an overworked graphic designer from Los Angeles, convinced that a few weeks of solitude in my RV would be the perfect antidote to my burnout. I'd spent months daydreaming about quiet nights under star-filled skies, far from deadlines and traffic jams. What I found instead was a nightmare that still haunts me. I arrived at the edge of the Modok region on a warm afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over rocky outcroppings and endless pine and juniper forests. The roads leading into the national forest were dusty and winding, but the scenery felt invigorating. I was determined to park somewhere off the main routes where I could properly disconnect. My GPS signal flickered in and out, but I managed to find a dirt clearing by a narrow trail. It looked like an ideal spot for a few days of rest. That first evening was calmer than anything I'd experienced in the city. I set up a small camp table, heated a can of soup, and listened to the wind hiss through the junipers. The hush of the forest lulled me, and for a moment I believed I'd finally found peace. I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the gentle sway of the RV. The next morning, I strolled through the woods in search of decent views to photograph. That's when I met Park Ranger Sylvia Chapman. She'd pulled over her ranger truck on the same dirt path, checking on the area. "You camping alone out here?" she asked, her tone friendly but tinged with concern. "Yeah, just trying to get away from the city," I admitted. She nodded. "I get it, but do me a favor, stay alert. We've had strange incidents lately, missing hikers, livestock turning up dead on nearby ranches. Some folks blame predators, but the injuries are unusual. I frowned. Unusual how? Sylvia hesitated. Honestly, it's best you keep your eyes open. If you see anything suspicious, come find me at the station off County Route 89. I thanked her, feeling unsettled by her warning. I'd assumed the worst I'd have to deal with was a coyote, or maybe a bear. After she drove off, I convinced myself she was just being extra cautious. Still, a kernel of anxiety lodged itself in my mind. That anxiety grew into real alarm later that day when, out of nowhere, my RV's battery went completely dead. I'd tested it before leaving LA and it was brand new. Yet, after I cooked lunch and listened to some music, the lights inside the RV flickered and died. No amount of tinkering helped. A sinking feeling told me this wasn't a simple mechanical glitch. Needing assistance, I decided to head toward a ranch I'd passed about a mile down the dirt road. I walked, trying not to worry too much, the late afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass. After 20 minutes, I spotted a sprawling property. Fences made of old wood, a dilapidated barn, and a modest house under towering pines. That was where I first encountered Gregory Faulkner. He was tending to a pair of horses in a corral, moving stiffly like an aging man who'd spent a lifetime working the land. He gave me a hard stare as I approached. "Help you?" he asked, not sounding particularly thrilled to see me. I introduced myself and explained the RV situation. For a moment, he just grunted, looking me up and down like he was deciding if I was trustworthy. Finally, he shook his head. "Ain't had visitors here in weeks," he muttered, "but you can stay in my barn if you need a roof while you sort out your RV. Not safe at night out in these woods, especially lately." He didn't elaborate on what he meant by not safe, but his frown deepened when I pressed him on it. I was about to thank him when a teenage girl appeared from behind the barn, curious eyes peeking around the corner. Amelia Faulkner, Gregory's granddaughter, as I later learned. She hovered at the edge of our conversation, occasionally glancing at me before looking away shyly. "Pop-Pop, are we letting him stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory nodded. "Just for a bit." I told them I needed to grab some supplies from my RV. Gregory offered to drive me in his old pickup. As we rattled along the dirt road, he pointed out broken fence lines and patchy fields. "Used to have more cattle," he said abruptly. "Couple months back, found half of them dead, drained of blood or close to it. Vet couldn't explain. No bite marks like a wolf or mountain lion, more like punctures, small holes." A chill climbed my spine. My mind jumped back to Ranger Chapman's words about unusual livestock deaths. Trying to keep calm, I asked if he'd heard any theories. He just shook his head, jaw tight. We arrived at my RV at dusk. I grabbed some essentials: flashlight, water, a sleeping bag, planning to bunk in Gregory's barn for a night or two. The inside of the RV was dim and lifeless without power, a stark contrast to the morning. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had tampered with it. Back at the ranch, Gregory showed me to a corner of the barn where I could sleep. The air smelled of hay and dust, and the rafters creaked in the evening breeze. Amelia hovered again, offering me an old lantern. She was quiet, but clearly curious. "Sorry about your RV," she mumbled. I gave her a small smile. "Thanks for the lantern. I'll figure something out soon." Night settled quickly, bringing a cold wind. Through the gaping barn doors, I could see the moon hovering above the treetops. I almost drifted off when a scream shattered the calm, an animalistic wail from outside. I bolted upright, heart pounding. Seconds later, Gregory burst into the barn with a shotgun in hand. "Stay here," he barked, eyes flashing. He darted out into the darkness, Curiosity overrode my caution. Clutching the lantern, I followed. In the corral, one of the horses was thrashing wildly against the fence. Gregory tried to calm it, but the animal's eyes rolled with terror. Then I saw it. 2 small, bloodied puncture marks along the horse's flank. Fresh, glistening wounds. My stomach churned. We heard a rustle near the tree line, a shape slipping away into the shadows. Gregory fired his shotgun, the boom echoing through the night, but I doubted he hit anything. Amelia appeared at the porch, tears in her eyes as she gazed at the injured horse. The next day, the horse was still alive, but weak. Gregory and I patched it up as best we could, but that morning confirmed there was something prowling near his ranch, a predator that didn't kill its prey outright, but left strange wounds. My rational side wanted to label it a large cat or some freak hybrid, but deep down, I sensed something unnatural at work. Around midday, Ranger Chapman arrived in her truck. Gregory had called her to report the incident. She examined the wounds, frowning deeply. "This looks like the others," she said, turning to me. "Same pattern, perfect circular holes, no typical bite radius." I could hardly believe I was standing there discussing bizarre injuries like they were an ordinary inconvenience. In the city, you'd chalk it up to an internet hoax, but here it was real, raw, and right in front of me. That afternoon, I was in the barn helping Gregory move bales of hay, thinking of ways to fix my RV and get the hell out of there. Amelia sidled up and tugged on my shirt sleeve. She carried a battered sketchbook and a few folded newspaper clippings. "I want to show you something," she said, glancing to ensure Gregory wasn't watching. We snuck behind the barn, where she laid out the clippings on an old tree stump. Headlines blared. Mysterious livestock deaths spread to next county. Local farmer reports vampire attacks on cattle. My pulse quickened. In one article, an old rancher claimed he saw a pale figure crouched over a dead cow, draining its blood. Authorities dismissed it as hysteria or a tall tale. Amelia then opened her sketchbook to reveal chilling drawings. A gaunt shape with sunken eyes and long fingers standing by a fence post under moonlight. In another, the creature hovered over a limp sheep. The stylized fangs were subtle, but they still made my skin crawl. "My dad told me stories," Amelia whispered. "He said it came from somewhere far away, maybe Europe. It can look almost human, but it's not." I swallowed hard. "You believe this thing is real?" She nodded. "I've seen it. I thought it was a sick coyote at first, but it stood up like a person. It watched me from the tree line." Even though it sounded insane, I believed her. The evidence was mounting, and my city-bred skepticism was crumbling. I told her to keep this between us for now. She nodded solemnly, hugging her sketchbook tight. As evening fell once more, a growing unease seeped into every corner of my mind. I tried to distract myself by figuring out how to tow my RV to a nearby town, but the local mechanic Gregory called was busy for at least another day, so I was stuck. That night, Gregory suggested we patrol the ranch perimeter together. He seemed resigned to the danger, shotgun cradled in his arms. I armed myself with a heavy flashlight, the strongest beam I had. The two of us scanned the fields, barn, and corrals, nerves taut. Every rustle or snap of a twig set my heart racing. Just before midnight, I glimpsed a pale shape sliding between the trees near the far fence line. I pointed my flashlight at it, and for half a second I saw a figure that looked nearly human, only impossibly thin. Its eyes glinted with animal hunger. Then it vanished behind a juniper. Gregory cursed under his breath, raised the shotgun, and we rushed forward. We reached the fence to find fresh footprints in the soft dirt, footprints that ended abruptly, as though the creature had leapt an impossible distance. My mind spun. What were we dealing with? We waited, tense. until dawn light began creeping over the horizon. Finally, we trudged back, both exhausted. Gregory's guarded expression told me he was genuinely rattled. I couldn't blame him. At midday, Amelia burst into the barn where I was trying to rest. "Grandpa!" she yelled, voice cracking. I followed her outside to see Gregory's dog lying motionless by the water trough, 2 unmistakable puncture wounds on its neck. My stomach lurched, and Amelia started to cry. Gregory clenched his jaw, rage flickering in his eyes. "That's it," he muttered. "We kill this thing or we all end up dead." He looked at me, and I could see the silent question. "Are you with me or not?" I nodded. "I'm with you, but how?" He told me about a hidden cave in the rocky outcroppings where he suspected the creature laired. Some of the older ranchers used to say that cave was cursed. I never believed it until now. In a mixture of horror and resolve, I agreed to help. Amelia wanted to come, but Gregory forbade it. We left her in the house with strict instructions to lock the doors and windows. Armed with flashlights, a couple of homemade stakes — Gregory insisted it was the only sure way to kill a vampire — and the shotgun, we set out in the late afternoon, hoping to catch the creature before nightfall gave it the advantage. The hike to the outcroppings was grueling, the jagged rocks jarring my ankles. Finally, we found a narrow crevice leading into darkness. We hesitated at the threshold. The air drifting from inside was stale and cold. My heart pounded so loudly, I worried the creature would hear it. Step by step, we descended into the gloom. The flashlight beams wavered across damp walls, revealing scraps of torn fabric, scattered animal bones, and the faint smell of rot. Dread thickened with each step. Then we saw it, or part of it. A flash of milky skin behind a boulder. Gregory aimed the shotgun and the blast echoed like thunder in the tight space. A shriek tore through the cave, something between a hiss and a howl. My flashlight flicked onto a hunched figure at the cave's far end, clutching its shoulder. It had features reminiscent of a human face, but the skin was too pale, the eyes too large. Blood slicked its mouth. Gregory fired again, but the creature darted out of sight. Shaking, I gripped a stake. We pressed deeper, the flicker of flashlights creating frantic shadows. Suddenly, it lunged from above, slamming into Gregory. They crashed onto the rocky floor, the shotgun skittering away. Gregory groaned in pain as the creature pinned him, jaw snapping inches from his neck. Without thinking, I drove the stake downward. The creature twisted, the stake only grazing its torso. It snarled, turning feral eyes on me. My lungs seized, but I thrust again. This time the point found a mark. It yowled, thrashing wildly. I scrambled back, hands shaking. Gregory, bruised but conscious, crawled toward the shotgun. He fired point blank. The roar nearly deafened me, and the creature spasmed, shriveling in on itself. A nauseating stench filled the air as it collapsed. Its chest caved in. Gregory and I stared, panting, half expecting it to rise again. Finally, we realized it was dead, or at least no longer a threat. We emerged from the cave, blinking against the fading daylight. Gregory leaned on me, cradling his bruised ribs. A wave of relief and disbelief washed over me. We'd faced something monstrous and lived. But as we navigated the trail back toward the ranch, a creeping fear whispered, what if that wasn't the only one? By the time we made it to the property, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Amelia raced out to meet us, tears in her eyes. Gregory was in pain, but insisted he would be all right. With help from Amelia, I cleaned his wounds and patched him up as best I could. We told her the creature was gone, that it wouldn't be coming back. She nodded, face pale, but relief showed in her eyes. That night, Ranger Chapman arrived to check on us. I recounted a sanitized version of the story, an unidentifiable predator in the cave killed by gunfire, but she seemed to read between the lines. She didn't push for more details, perhaps sensing we'd had enough trauma. She left, promising to schedule a thorough sweep of the area. In the following days, Gregory recovered slowly. His horses showed no further signs of attack, and the ranch felt lighter somehow, as if free from a looming shadow. With the mechanic finally available, my RV got towed and repaired. The battery cables had been severed by something with sharpened edges, not mere wear and tear. Before leaving, I took a quiet walk around the property, still in disbelief about what had transpired. Amelia was sitting by the fence, sketchbook in hand. She handed me a page, her drawing of me and Gregory standing over the collapsed creature. "Thanks," I said, swallowing a lump in my throat. "You're really talented." She half smiled. "Thank you, and thanks for helping us." Gregory emerged onto the porch, leaning on a cane. He gave me a curt nod. I understood it as his own brand of gratitude. I drove away with a mixture of relief, triumph, and a twinge of sadness. I had come here to escape my life's stress, never imagining I'd be pulled into a battle with something I once thought only existed in legends. Yet, in confronting real danger, I found a piece of my lost courage. Sometimes it takes a brush with the unimaginable to remind us what we're capable of. Back in LA, I often recall those stark pine forests and the hush over Gregory's ranch. Late at night, when my mind drifts, I see flickers of that pale figure crouching in the shadows, hear the echo of its shriek in the cave. I've told a few friends about my experience, keeping the details vague, and they laugh, assuming I'm exaggerating a coyote attack or letting my imagination run wild. But I know the truth of what I saw out there, and so does Gregory Faulkner. Whether the evil is truly gone or just lying low in some uncharted cavern, I can't say for sure. All I know is that if you decide to head into those lonely roads by the Modok National Forest in search of peace, keep your eyes open after dark. Not every legend is a myth, and some predators wear a face almost human, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My name is Miranda Lakefield, and I was 29 years old when it happened near Jedediah Smith Redwoods State Park in Northern California. I had driven my aging RV up the coast, intending to spend a week photographing the ancient redwood forests for my freelance portfolio. More than that, though, I was hoping the stillness of those towering trees would help me process my mother's recent passing. She'd always loved nature, and finishing this photo series was my final promise to her. I arrived on a misty afternoon, with fog clinging to the base of the trees like an ethereal blanket. The narrow road wound deeper into the forest until I found a half-hidden turnout. The only hint of civilization was a battered sign reading, "Logging Road, use at your own risk." Perfect, I thought. A quiet spot where I could set up camp without other people around. The redwoods soared overhead, their rust-colored trunks vanishing into a canopy of damp green leaves. Despite the chill, I felt a small spark of excitement at photographing this secret world. After parking my RV, I decided to take a quick walk to stretch my legs. The earth was spongy underfoot, covered in thick layers of pine needles and moss. A cool breeze rustled the ferns. I heard the faint sound of water, maybe a creek, somewhere to my right. As I was contemplating how to photograph such a serene scene, a ranger truck rumbled up the old logging road. A woman with a friendly but cautious face stepped out. "Hi there, I'm Ranger Fiona Barnes," she said, tipping her wide-brimmed hat. "You camping out here alone?" "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Name's Miranda. I'm working on a nature photography project." She gave a short nod. "You might want to find a designated campsite. We've had weird happenings in these parts. strange sightings, missing travelers. No official explanation yet, but be careful. Some of these old roads are in terrible shape. I could tell she was being diplomatic, trying not to sound alarmist, but her eyes held concern. I'll keep my eyes open, I promised. Once she left, the stillness returned. I snapped a few test shots, capturing the interplay of mist and dappled light through the redwood canopy. Then I returned to the RV, ready to settle in for the night. The air turned colder, and a hush fell over the forest. I found myself missing my mother's voice, which had always calmed me during anxious moments. At some point in the early evening, I drove to the nearest gas station for supplies. While topping off the tank, I met another camper, a woman named Amanda Chu, around my age, with a battered van parked by the pumps. We exchanged pleasantries about the region and joked about how easy it was to get lost amid the towering trees. "Yeah, I'm traveling solo too," she said with a laugh, though there was nervousness in her eyes. "I kept hearing this weird sound last night, like a woman crying, but nobody was around." I shrugged it off, though my curiosity piqued. We parted ways, wishing each other luck. Little did I know it was the last time I'd see her. Back at my pullout, night descended fast. The fog thickened, creeping across the damp ground. I tried to read under the glow of my RV's overhead light, but I kept losing focus, my mind drifting. Exhaustion eventually overtook me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a distant, mournful cry echoing through the forest. My heart thudded. It sounded like a woman wailing, the notes lifting in pitch, then fading into silence. I cracked open the window, half believing it might be an animal call. But the hush that followed was too complete, like the forest itself held its breath. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe the trees groaning under their own weight. Still, my hands shook, and I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, unable to shake that eerie cry, I decided to seek out someone who knew the area better. On the ranger's advice, I headed down a rough trail toward a small cabin near the Smith River. There, I found Willard Will Parker, a local historian. He greeted me warily until I explained I was a photographer looking for old logging sites. He eyed me with skepticism. "Not many folks go messing around those sites," he said, stroking his gray beard. "Been rumored to be haunted since the logging tragedies of the 19th century. That caught my attention. Haunted how? Will gave a resigned shrug. "They say a widow lost her husband in a logging accident. A tree came down the wrong way, crushed half a camp. The woman died soon after, some say from grief, others say from something worse. Locals call her a banshee. Some claim if you hear her cry, it's a warning of death or tragedy." His words sent a shiver through me. I didn't press the subject, but I couldn't help recalling the ghostly sob I'd heard last night. I thanked Will for his time, ignoring the uneasy knot in my stomach. Late that afternoon, I explored more of the forest with my camera, capturing mist-shrouded trunks and emerald ferns. But every time I looked through the lens, I felt like something hovered just at the edge of my vision. Once, I thought I saw a figure draped in white, flickering between the trees. I snapped a photo on reflex, but when I checked the preview, there was only a blur. The sun was dipping low when I returned to the RV. A sticky note fluttered against my door, pinned by a small branch. It read, in shaky handwriting, "Couldn't sleep. Going deeper in to figure out that sound. Wish me luck." It was signed, Amanda. My gut twisted. She'd come by and found me gone. Night settled in again, with the redwoods looming like silent giants around my campsite. I tried to rest, but the memory of that cry and the knowledge that Amanda was out there kept me alert. Around midnight, that same wailing sound drifted through the fog, louder this time, echoing off the trunks. It made my hair stand on end. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the forest. The beam caught swirls of fog, branches, and not much else. Yet the lament continued, faint but insistent, tugging at something deep in my chest, like it wanted me to follow. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to remain near the RV. If Amanda had gone looking for the source, I'd be no help wandering blindly at night. I told myself to wait for dawn. In the morning, I drove to the ranger station, anxious about Amanda's note. Ranger Fiona listened, her brow creasing with worry. She confirmed no one else had seen Amanda. "I'll put out a missing person alert," she said, "but that could take time. Some folks vanish for a day or two, then turn up fine." Her words didn't reassure me. Amanda's note suggested she'd gone into the forest at night, chasing a ghostly cry. I asked if there were places people got lost easily. Fiona mentioned an abandoned logging site about a mile past my campsite. I decided to check there myself. Fiona insisted on accompanying me, but she was short-staffed and had to finish a morning patrol. I promised I'd be cautious, though my nerves were on edge. Armed with a flashlight, camera, and a small can of bear spray, I trudged along the logging road. Massive stumps dotted the area, remnants of a past industry. Tangled ferns and mossy logs obscured old footpaths. The air was damp and heavy, muffling my footsteps. I found crumbling cabins, wood sagging from decades of rain and neglect, littered with rusted tools. There was no sign of Amanda. I did, however, discover a fresh footprint in the mud, roughly her shoe size. My heart lurched. She had been here. The footprint led deeper in. I followed until the brush became too thick to pass. No more footprints, no sign of her. The only thing left was an unsettling hush among the towering redwoods, like the forest withheld secrets. While returning to my RV, I suddenly felt a cold breeze snake around me. A whispery moan echoed through the trees, and I whipped around, scanning for any sign of a person. Instead, a figure drifted through my peripheral vision. A woman in a pale, tattered dress. I pivoted, but the figure vanished behind the massive trunk of a redwood. My heart pounded in my ears as I hurried on, half expecting something to grab me from behind. By the time I reached my campsite, a gray twilight covered the forest. The wind had picked up, rattling branches overhead. It felt like a storm was coming. My chest tightened with dread. Setting up a small lantern, I tried to calm myself. If Amanda was still out there, she was in grave danger. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I crouched in my RV, staring at the swirling fog through the windshield. Then the wail began anew, closer now, as if circling my clearing. Every hair on my body stood on end. The sound was more than a cry. It was full of agony, layered with an otherworldly timbre. My mind flashed to Will's words about the banshee, how it preyed on grief and sorrow. My grief over my mother's death welled up, raw and unguarded. Tears pricked at my eyes. I felt a wave of guilt, remembering how I hadn't made it home in time to say goodbye. The wailing grew louder, resonating in my bones. It was like the spirit was calling me out, feeding on my vulnerability, or perhaps warning me of some greater loss to come. Lightning lit the sky, revealing a hunched figure outside. In the split second of bright illumination, I saw a face half hidden by tangled hair, mouth open in an anguished scream. I scrambled for my camera, irrationally thinking a photo might help me understand. Another flash, the figure was gone, replaced by swirling fog and swaying ferns. Shaking, I forced myself out of the RV. I couldn't hide forever. If the legend was true, that the banshee's cry heralded tragedy, then I needed to confront it. Maybe I could find Amanda, or at least discover her fate. The storm broke in earnest, rain slamming down through the canopy. My flashlight barely cut the gloom as I followed the wailing deeper into the forest, each step splashing through mud and detritus. After trudging half a mile, I reached a clearing shaped by fallen redwoods. Piles of rotting logs formed a natural ring, like the skeleton of an abandoned lumber operation. In the middle stood a single moss-covered gravestone leaning at a precarious angle. The banshee's cry seemed to emanate from that very spot. My hands trembled on the flashlight, and my breath clouded in the cold air. I inched closer. In another lightning flash, she stood there, the banshee, her form half-translucent, torn dress clinging to a gaunt body. Her eyes were hollow, yet somehow full of pain. I wanted to run, but my legs locked up. The wail reached a crescendo, and an image burst into my mind the moment I heard about my mother's death, the crushing guilt that I'd been too busy to visit sooner. Tears mingled with the rain on my cheeks. "Stop!" I shouted, though my voice quivered. "What do you want?" She fixed her empty gaze on me. For an instant, her face shifted, and I saw my own mother's eyes staring back, filled with sorrow. I nearly collapsed, overwhelmed by the sense of loss. Then the banshee raised a spectral arm, pointing to a shape slumped at the far edge of the clearing. I edged closer, pulse pounding, until my flashlight beam revealed a crumpled body. It was Amanda. She lay in the mud, soaked, eyes half closed. Alive or dead, I couldn't tell. I rushed over, ignoring the banshee's shrieking presence. Amanda's chest rose and fell faintly. Relief surged through me. I lifted her head, tried to rouse her. She coughed weakly, blinking in confusion. "I heard her," she mumbled. "I followed. Got lost. So cold." The banshee's cry rose, sharp as a blade, forcing me to clamp my hands over my ears. Amanda moaned. Fear and delirium etched on her face. Storm-driven wind flattened the ferns. Lightning illuminated the clearing again, and the banshee's image flickered like a dying candle flame. I didn't know if she wanted to help Amanda or condemn us both. I thought of my mother, how her final wish was for me to keep living, to find purpose beyond grief. Summoning courage, I locked eyes with the banshee, tears streaming down my face. "You're in pain," I whispered, voice cracking. "But you're trapping us in it too. Please, let us go." The wailing faltered, dropping a pitch. The banshee's form wavered, and I sensed a moment of hesitation. I reached out a trembling hand, not to touch the spirit, but to acknowledge her sorrow. Another thunderclap shattered the air. When the lightning flashed, she was gone, and the clearing was quiet, save for the rain and Amanda's ragged breathing. Heart hammering, I helped Amanda stand. She leaned on me, shivering uncontrollably. We navigated slick logs and puddles back to my RV. By the time we arrived, the storm's fury had diminished to a steady downpour. I wrapped Amanda in blankets, blasting the RV's heater. Gradually, her trembling subsided. When morning light finally filtered through the treetops, we stepped outside to find the fallen limbs and debris from the storm scattered around us. No sign remained of the banshee. Yet the memory of that mournful wail lingered in the damp air. I couldn't shake the feeling that her sorrow had mirrored my own, and somehow, by facing her, I'd taken a step toward healing. Amanda and I found Ranger Fiona later that day. Fiona was relieved to see Amanda alive, though shocked by our story of a ghostly figure. She briefly mentioned an official search for the unknown presence, but I suspected it would turn up nothing tangible. Some things in these ancient woods defied simple explanation. Before I left the region, I visited Will Parker to tell him what happened. He seemed unsurprised, only asked if we were harmed. I told him the spirit's final cry felt more like release than a threat. He nodded gravely. She's probably found some measure of rest, he said. That same afternoon, I packed my RV and said goodbye to Amanda, who was still shaken but determined to continue her travels once she recovered. As for me, I had my photos, captivating images of redwoods cloaked in fog. More importantly, I felt a slight unburdening in my chest. The banshee's lament had forced me to confront the weight of my own grief, and in acknowledging it, I'd found a sliver of peace. I drove away, the towering trees gradually thinning until I rejoined the main highway. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I see those silhouettes in the mist, the ancient logging ruins, and that solitary gravestone. I still feel my mother's absence acutely, but I carry a renewed sense of purpose, because in that haunted forest, I learned that sorrow connects all living beings, and sometimes even the restless dead. And I promised myself that as long as I walk through nature's depths, I'll remember that beneath every haunting cry lies a story longing to be acknowledged, and perhaps finally laid to rest. My name is Sharon Hayes. I was 41 years old when this happened in the remote depths of the Lassen National Forest in Northern California. At the time, I was a freshly divorced accountant determined to prove that I could handle life on my own. I'd bought a used RV and mapped out a winding trip through lesser-known areas, telling myself the solitude of the mountains would help me find peace, and maybe even a new sense of identity. When I first rolled into the Lassen region, the scenery took my breath away. Towering pines stretched toward an impossibly blue sky, and the air was crisp, scented with resin and damp earth. I could feel my tension easing as I navigated a narrow, unpaved logging road leading deeper into the forest. Bumping along, I finally spotted an overgrown clearing by a small lake. Quiet, secluded, and perfect for my first night off-grid. Despite some nagging worries about isolation, I told myself that facing my fears was the whole point of this trip. As I stepped out of my RV, the wind murmured through tall grass, and the reflection of the pine line wavered on the lake's still surface. I inhaled deeply. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. No ex-husband, no ringing phone, just me and nature. That evening, while I was tidying up inside, someone knocked on my RV door. Startled, I almost dropped a plate. Through the window, I saw a weathered-looking man in a park ranger uniform. He gave a polite wave, and I opened the door cautiously. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm Ranger Cecil Whitlock. We don't see many campers this far in. Just wanted to make sure you're aware of the conditions." I introduced myself and explained my mission to see the forest's hidden corners. He nodded, but his brow furrowed. "Roads around here can be tricky," he cautioned. "Folks have gotten stuck or gone missing, especially near the deeper woodlands. We're not sure what's happening, but the forest has its secrets. Keep your wits about you." His words sent a small tremor through my newfound courage. I forced a smile, thanked him, and watched him climb into his truck. As the engine rumbled away, the sense of isolation returned, tenfold. Late that night, I woke to faint knocking sounds outside, like someone was tapping on a distant tree. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was just branches shifting in the breeze. I sat in the RV's dim living area, hugging my knees, listening as the knocks came in uneven intervals, sometimes near, sometimes farther away. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, hoping to distract myself from lingering unease, I decided to explore. The lake shimmered under a pale sun as I made coffee over a small propane stove. After breakfast, I drove the RV toward a marked spring a few miles away for fresh water. The road was rutted, and my tires kicked up clouds of dust. When I arrived at the spring, I saw a scrawny, beaming man wrestling with a portable water filter. He introduced himself as Nathan Pierce, a self-proclaimed wildlife enthusiast. I noticed he had a notebook stuffed with what looked like plaster molds of large footprints. My curiosity got the better of me. "What's with the casts?" I asked. He grinned, eyes shining. "Sasquatch footprints. Well, at least that's what I think they are." Seeing my skeptical look, he explained that sightings of a large, bipedal creature had spiked recently in Lassen. "I'm here to prove it's real. People have disappeared, and some say it's the Sasquatch. It's been more aggressive lately." I felt my stomach twist. First, Ranger Whitlock's warnings. Now this. "That seems dangerous," I murmured. Nathan shrugged. "If you see or hear anything unusual, let me know. I've set up a trail cam near mile marker 14 off a dirt spur road." He handed me a scrap of paper with his satellite phone number scribbled on it. Though I wasn't convinced about Sasquatch, I couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Before we parted ways, he cautioned me to be careful if I kept traveling alone. On my way back, I passed a small camper parked in a makeshift site about a mile from mine. Curious, I pulled over. A friendly woman named Jane Booker stepped out, waving. She seemed relieved to have human company. We chatted about traveling alone, about the sense of freedom, but also the underlying fear. "Nature's beautiful," Jane said, "but there's something off here lately. Last night I heard these guttural howls, then banging. It sounded too deliberate to be random wildlife. Gave me the creeps." Her words matched what I'd heard in the night, and I felt a chill. We parted with tentative plans to meet again, maybe share a campfire. But that evening, my nerves got the better of me. I holed up in my RV, reading by lantern light. The forest grew dark fast, the sky cloudy with no moon. Then, not long after I turned the lantern off, the knocking returned, louder, more forceful. The noise reverberated through the clearing. I peered outside but saw only shifting shadows. Fear bubbled in my chest, and I half expected an intruder. Yet no human figure materialized. I told myself to stay calm and locked every door. Eventually, dawn light crept in, chasing away the night's terrors. Driven by a jolt of anxiety, I decided to check on Jane. When I arrived at her site, I froze. Her small camper was a disaster zone. The door was twisted half off its hinges, as if something enormous had yanked it open. One side panel was ripped, bearing deep gouges that looked like claw marks. Jane was nowhere to be found. My heart hammered against my ribcage. I called her name, scanning the area for any sign of her. The only response was the wind rattling the battered camper. Panicking, I sprinted back to my RV and tried calling for help, but my cell phone displayed 0 bars. I started the ignition, determined to drive out to the nearest ranger station. The engine clicked but wouldn't turn over. Disbelief crashed over me. My battery had been fine. I tried again, pressing the gas, still nothing. Trembling, I popped the hood. The battery cables hung loose, as if they'd been tampered with or violently jostled. I had basic mechanical knowledge, but the bracket looked bent as though from a tremendous force. My mind flickered to the savage damage on Jane's camper. What was strong enough to do that? Desperate, I grabbed a small toolkit and tried my best to reconnect everything. While I fumbled with the cables, a deep, resonant howl drifted from somewhere in the forest. It was unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard. The pitch rose, tapered off, then resumed in a lower octave. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the wrench. The howls continued, each wave sending adrenaline surging through my veins. Somehow, I got the RV to start again, though it ran rough. I managed to drive a short distance back onto the main logging road, hoping to make it to a ranger checkpoint. Partway, I saw Ranger Whitlock's truck approaching fast from the opposite direction. Relief flared in me. I waved him down, breathless, recounting the state of Jane's camper and the guttural howls. His weathered face tightened. "I've heard rumors about a large creature, but we've never had real proof. Let's go see what we can find." We returned to Jane's site together. He took photos of the damage, radioing in that we had a missing camper. We scoured the surrounding bushes and found a single, enormous footprint in the mud near the tree line. It dwarfed my own foot by at least half. Ranger Whitlock muttered something under his breath about the old local legends. Before we could investigate further, footsteps crashed through the underbrush. Nathan burst into the clearing, wide-eyed. "I got something on the trail cam. Dark silhouette, huge, looked like it was carrying something." The three of us locked eyes. My stomach flipped at the idea that Jane might have been dragged away by this creature. Nathan insisted we check the ravine near mile marker 14, where he'd seen fresh tracks earlier. Whitlock agreed, but warned me it could be dangerous. I couldn't stand the thought of leaving Jane, possibly injured and alone, without trying, so I insisted on joining. We piled into Whitlock's truck, and I prayed the creature wouldn't appear in the open. The drive was harrowing over rough dirt paths, the ranger's truck rattling with each rut. Eventually, we parked near a collapsed wooden bridge, forced to continue on foot. The forest here felt denser, the air colder. Branches arched overhead, forming a canopy that filtered out the sunlight. Nathan led the way, cross-referencing his notes. The deeper we went, the more we found unnatural signs. Large footprints, broken saplings, and matted vegetation where something big might have bedded down. An uneasy hush cloaked the pines. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled through the trees. We crouched, hearts pounding. With painstaking slowness, we edged forward. Peering down into a shallow ravine, we saw a nest-like area of snapped branches and pine needles. Strewn about were bits of torn fabric. A battered camp chair, Jane's chair. My throat constricted. She had been here. But no sign of her body or remains, thank God, though that left horrifying possibilities. A roar shattered the silence. Twisting around, I glimpsed a hulking shape lurching between trees. It moved faster than anything that size should be able to. Adrenaline exploded through me. Nathan raised a flare gun, trembling. The creature let out another roar. It was tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair, features lost in the thick undergrowth. But I sensed its intelligence in the way it eyed us. Ranger Whitlock fired a warning shot from his rifle into the air. That startled it. It darted away, the ground quaking beneath its heavy strides. We scrambled up the ravine, hearts hammering. Nathan was panting, a shallow scrape on his forearm from diving behind a log. "We have to get out of here," he gasped. "That thing could come back." Whitlock nodded, face grim. "There's no way we can handle it alone. We'll call in backup, but Jane, if she's still alive..." His sentence hung unfinished. Guilt and horror churned in my gut. We retreated to the ranger's truck, only to discover the tires slashed and deep claw marks across the doors. The creature must have circled back, quietly disabling our escape. Now we were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with darkness fast approaching. Panic threatened to consume me, but I remembered why I'd come here in the first place. To face my fears, to prove to myself that I was strong enough to handle adversity. If I gave in to terror, we'd all be doomed. "What about my RV?" I asked, voice shaking. "It's a couple miles down the main road." Whitlock rubbed his temples. "That might be our only shot. We'll have to hike there." We gathered what we could. Nathan's flare gun, a few flashlights, and Whitlock's rifle. Then we hurried along the rough trail, scanning the forest for signs of the beast. The sun sank lower, the sky blushing orange through the canopy. Our footsteps crunched on fallen needles, each snap making me flinch. The deeper gloom gave every trunk and shadow a menacing shape. We hadn't gone far when a thunderous crash echoed behind us. Leaves fluttered. A massive silhouette bounded across the trail, cutting us off. I swallowed hard, shining my flashlight into the creature's face. Golden eyes reflected the beam. It roared, exposing large, blunt teeth. Definitely not just a bear or an ape, something else altogether. Something primal. Whitlock raised his rifle, but the shot went wide as the beast lunged. We dove aside, my flashlight tumbling into the bushes. A tangle of fur and muscle slammed into a nearby tree, shaking the ground. Nathan fired a flare. The bright burst illuminated the beast's snarling features. Thick, matted fur, eyes wide with rage or fear. Momentarily blinded, it staggered back. "Run!" Whitlock yelled, pulling me up. We sprinted through the forest, half-blind ourselves, adrenaline fueling each step. The creature's roars echoed, but the flare's light gave us a precious head start. At last, we broke into my campsite's clearing. The RV stood there like a lifeline. I fumbled with the keys, hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped them. Whitlock and Nathan scanned the darkening tree line, rifles and flares at the ready. The moment I unlocked the door, they piled inside. I scrambled to start the engine, praying the earlier fix would hold. It groaned, coughed, then roared to life. Relief flooded me. Nathan banged on the window, eyes wide. Through the windshield, I saw the beast charging the clearing. In a moment of terror, I slammed the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, and the creature darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the front fender. It slammed its massive fist against the passenger side, denting the metal. We screamed, but the tires found traction, and we sped onto the bumpy logging road. For several agonizing minutes, we heard the beast's roars chasing behind us, snapping branches echoing in the night. Slowly, the roars faded, replaced by the labored growl of the RV's engine. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white. Once we were sure the creature was gone, or at least too far to follow, we exhaled in shaky relief. Dawn found us limping into a small ranger outpost on the forest's outskirts. Exhausted, battered, we recounted everything to the stunned staff. They organized a search party for Jane, though I harbored little hope. Whitlock quietly assured me they'd do everything they could. Nathan, pale and shaken, kept muttering about how he'd always wanted to prove the Sasquatch existed, but never dreamed it would be so violent. As for me, I packed what I could from the RV's battered interior. The side was scarred by deep dents where the creature struck. Days later, the search concluded. No trace of Jane beyond the wreckage we'd seen. Local authorities spoke vaguely about an unknown predator, never fully acknowledging the cryptid rumor. Ranger Whitlock gave me a ride to a nearby town. Before parting, he told me to stay strong, that surviving what I did showed more resilience than many people ever muster. I still wake in the night, hearing that thunderous roar echo in my dreams. When I close my eyes, I see claw marks raked across Jane's camper, remembering the horrifying realization that she might have been carried off into those dark woods. I no longer doubt that something huge and intelligent lurks in Lassen's hidden depths. Locals whisper about it, but few will speak openly. And while I ache for Jane's fate, I also emerged from this ordeal with a conviction I never had before. I set out to conquer my fear of solitude, and in the end, I found a terror beyond imagination. But I also discovered in myself a core of courage I never suspected was there. Life is fragile, and nature is fierce. Part of me grieves for the forest itself, and even for the wounded beast that might still roam among the pines, as lost in its own violent world as I once was in mine. All I know is that I escaped with my life, a battered RV, and a story that no one back in my old office would ever believe. Yet the fear and the awe I experienced are as real as the scars on my RV's metal skin. Even now, I can't look at tall pines without shivering, but I refuse to let that fear consume me. After all, facing the unknown, whether it's the future or a creature in the woods, is the only way we truly discover who we are, and I know who I am now, Sharon Hayes, survivor. My name is Elena Chavez, and I was 38 years old when this happened in the desert hills near Bodie, an old ghost town in the eastern Sierra of California. I had just lost my job as a librarian in Southern California and felt uprooted from everything I'd known. Around the same time, I inherited a small patch of land near Bodie, an unexpected windfall from a distant relative. With no immediate prospects and a lingering grief over my mother's recent passing, I loaded my belongings into a second-hand RV and drove north, telling myself that a change of scenery might help me heal. As I drew closer to Bodie, the landscape shifted dramatically. The pine forest gave way to wide stretches of sagebrush, and the sun baked the rolling hills in relentless heat. In the distance, I saw abandoned wooden structures perched like ghosts on the horizon, the remnants of a once thriving mining town. Dust devils spiraled across the highway, and the wind whipped against my RV. Part of me wondered if I was making a terrible mistake, but I pressed on, determined to see what I'd inherited. When I arrived at the property line, I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. The land itself was modest, a few acres of scrubby desert with a battered fence and the crumbling foundation of what must have been a small house. An old well sat in the corner, capped with rotting boards. A large sign half buried in tumbleweeds bore my family name, Chavez, and below that, no trespassing. I parked my RV in the flattest spot I could find. The air shimmered with heat, and a stiff breeze carried the faint smell of dust and sage. This might have been a homestead decades ago, but now it was just lonely earth with scattered fragments of a life long forgotten. I tried to imagine my distant relative living here, forging a living amid scorching summers and freezing winters. My heart clenched at the thought that I, too, had nowhere else to be. Not long after I stepped outside to stretch my legs, a dusty pickup rattled onto the property. Out climbed a tall man in his late 40s, wearing a worn cowboy hat. He introduced himself as Tucker Reyes, the local handyman and caretaker who'd kept an eye on my land for a few years. "Figured you'd show up soon," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Heard about your inheritance. Surprised you made it this far off the main road. It's a tough drive." I smiled, trying to hide my nerves. "Thanks for coming by. Everything looks pretty run down." Tucker nodded. "Sure is. But it's still good land, if you don't mind a little dust and desert wind. Some folks say it's haunted ground, though, especially after dark." He must have seen the skeptical look on my face because he chuckled. "Old stories, mostly. Bodie has a reputation. People talk about ghosts of miners or weeping women seen wandering the desert. Probably nonsense." I laughed politely, but a part of me prickled with unease. I asked him to show me around, and he pointed out the collapsed outbuilding, the precarious old well, and the sagging remains of a fence line that needed replacing. He also suggested I keep my RV locked at night, because coyotes, or worse, might poke around. After Tucker left, I spent the afternoon sweeping debris away from the well. The boards covering it were half rotten, so I nailed a few planks across the opening for safety. Something about that well unsettled me, as if it could swallow me up if I leaned too close. The only water around here, it seemed, was the bottled stuff in my RV's storage and the occasional dusty stream miles away. Night fell quickly. The desert sky offered a dazzling view of stars, but the wind didn't let up. Gusts rattled my RV, and I heard distant howls. Coyotes, I told myself. though my heart pounded a little faster with each eerie cry. Exhaustion finally coaxed me into a restless sleep. Sometime near midnight, I woke to a faint sound, like a woman crying. I sat up, disoriented, straining to hear over the wind. The sobs rose and fell, seeming to come from somewhere near the well. My skin went cold, but I had to check it out. Grabbing a flashlight, I inched outside. The wind buffeted me, swirling dust around my ankles. I swept the beam across the property. The old well stood silent, just a dark shape in the gloom. No sign of anyone. Yet the sound persisted, a heartbreaking moan on the breeze. I stayed awake until dawn, nerves on edge. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just the wind. But when I went to inspect the ground near the well, I found something bizarre. Bare footprints in the dust, small like a woman's feet. More unsettling was that the earth in those footprints was damp, as if soaked with water. Yet the rest of the ground was bone dry. I crouched down, pressing my hand into the dust. It left a perfectly dry impression. Confusion churned in my chest. Who would be wandering barefoot here in the middle of the night? Later that day, I drove my RV into the nearest small town to pick up supplies. On the way, I spotted a police SUV parked along the lonely highway. Its driver was Deputy Clara Michaels, who waved me down, likely noticing my out-of-state plates. I explained I'd inherited property near Bodie, and she asked if I'd seen any unusual activity. There've been a few reports of missing livestock from a ranch close by, she said. And last week, someone disturbed some old grave markers in Bodie's cemetery. People claim they heard crying late at night. If you notice anything odd, please let me know, and keep your RV locked. Don't go out alone at night. The mention of grave disturbances and crying set me on edge. I admitted hearing something strange near my well. Clara's eyes flickered with concern. Sometimes, folks mention the legend of La Llorona around here. An old story about a weeping woman's ghost. Probably nothing, but be cautious. I'd heard of La Llorona before in passing, a tragic figure from Hispanic folklore. But to think the legend might be wandering around these dusty hills felt surreal. I thanked her and continued to the local market, where I stocked up on water, canned goods, and a few tools I might need to secure the well. My rational side wanted to dismiss the ghost stories, but part of me recalled those damp footprints and the sorrowful sob I couldn't explain. On my way back, a sign for Bodie State Historic Park caught my eye, so I turned off to explore. A cluster of old buildings, rotting in the sun, told of a long-ago mining boom gone bust. As I wandered the deserted streets, I bumped into an older man with a weathered face, carrying a camera. He introduced himself as Manny Delgado, a retired history teacher fascinated by Bodie's lore. He saw my curious expression and started explaining the tragedies that had befallen the town. Mine collapses, fires, disease outbreaks. Then, in a hushed tone, he mentioned sightings of a weeping ghost near the creek that once supplied the town's water. Some say she lost her children in a flash flood. Others claim she's searching for them, forever trapped in her sorrow. It's not uncommon for folks to see her in deserted places, especially on stormy or moonlit nights. Something in Manny's voice made my stomach lurch. I told him about my inherited land and the strange sobbing I'd heard. He nodded gravely. If it truly is La Llorona, you should be careful. She's drawn to places of tragedy and to people who carry grief in their hearts. His words stung, reminding me of my own sorrow over my mother's death, how I hadn't been there at the end. Manny offered me a phone number in case you want to learn more about the local history. Then he ambled off, leaving me unsettled. That night, my mind buzzed with worry. I locked every door, every window, and tried to sleep. But around midnight, the crying began again, louder, closer. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I glanced out the RV's window, and for one heart-stopping moment I saw a shape. A woman in what looked like a long white dress, the hem shimmering as though wet. She was standing near the well, face obscured by long dark hair. I gasped, fumbling for my flashlight. By the time I flicked it on and shone it outside, the figure was gone. In a moment of panic, I considered driving off right then, but fear kept me rooted in place, afraid to step out into the darkness. Come morning, Tucker arrived to check on me. He found me disheveled, with dark circles under my eyes. I told him about the figure in white. He listened quietly, then let out a shaky breath. I've seen her. A couple years back, real late one night, drifting through the sagebrush. Heard her crying, too. That's why some folks won't come near Bodie after sunset. He urged me to sell the property, to leave, but I felt strangely compelled to stay. Maybe it was my stubbornness, or maybe I believed if there was a restless spirit here I could help put it to rest. The land had belonged to someone in my family, after all. I couldn't just abandon it. That evening, a dust storm gathered. The wind howled, picking up grit that pelted my RV like tiny bullets. The sky turned a sickly orange. I barricaded myself inside, a flashlight by my side, hoping the storm would drown out the ghostly crying. Instead, it seemed to magnify it. The wails rose in pitch, echoing in the gusts. The entire RV shook. Unable to bear it any longer, I threw on a jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the storm. Sand whipped at my face. I followed the sound, stumbling toward the well. My heart thudded when I saw that the boards I'd nailed in place were torn away, scattered in the dirt. Standing at the well's edge was the same white-clad figure, shoulders hunched in sorrow. Her hair clung to her face in sodden strands, even though not a drop of rain had fallen. Each sob that tore from her seemed to tug at my own grief, a reminder of my regrets and the mother I'd lost. I inched closer. "Who are you?" I shouted over the wind. She turned her head slightly, revealing a glimpse of a pallid cheek. Then she beckoned me forward, her hand trembling as if pleading for help. My body felt numb, but I took another step. The wind whipped so fiercely I could barely stand. A faint voice in the back of my head screamed at me to run. Yet something about her sorrow cut through my fear. I recognized that kind of raw pain. She let out a keening wail, then seized my wrist with a shockingly cold grip. I cried out, struggling against her hold. Her eyes, dark and full of anguish, bored into mine. For a split second I saw images. Faces of children in old-fashioned clothes, a flash flood sweeping them away, a woman collapsing in despair. Then I realized she was dragging me toward the open mouth of the well. The edges of the well yawned like a hungry maw. Terror exploded in my chest as she tried to pull me in. I fought back, kicking at her. The wind howled, stinging my eyes with dust. My foot struck the well's rim, sending pain shooting through my ankle. I clung to the jagged stones with my free hand, refusing to be dragged down. Suddenly, something small and metallic in my pocket pressed against my thigh, my mother's old rosary, which I'd carried more out of sentiment than faith. In desperation, I ripped it free and brandished it at the ghostly figure. She recoiled, her grip loosening enough for me to yank my arm away. Her wail intensified, full of rage and heartbreak, and the storm seemed to roar in response. Clutching the rosary, I scrambled backward, coughing on swirling dust. Through the haze, I saw the figure crumple, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. With a final soul-piercing lament, she vanished into the storm. I crawled away from the well, lungs burning, tears streaking the dust on my cheeks. The wind died down as quickly as it had arisen, leaving an eerie stillness. My hands shook so violently I could hardly push myself off the ground. I staggered back to the RV, collapsed inside, and lay there panting. By dawn, the storm's debris littered the property. My body felt bruised, my wrist marked with faint, icy prints. But the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, as if some malevolent force had receded. I called Deputy Clara Michaels to report what happened. She arrived with Tucker not long after, both wearing wary expressions. They found the well half filled with rubble from the storm, but no sign of footprints or watery tracks. I showed them my wrist, though the marks had already faded. I expected them to be skeptical, but Tucker just gave me a solemn nod, while Clara offered a sympathetic grimace. "We've had calls like yours before," she admitted. "I'm just glad you're okay. Not everyone is so lucky." Over the next few days, Manny Delgado reached out to me, wanting to see if I was still alive and well. I told him about the confrontation. He listened thoughtfully, then said something that struck me. "Grief draws her. Maybe your sorrow mirrored hers, allowing her to manifest more strongly. But you found the strength to fight back, and perhaps grant her a moment of release." The land felt different after that. I no longer heard weeping at night. The wind blew less fiercely, and the well stood silent, boards replaced and weighted down with heavy stones. Deputy Clara told me she'd keep an eye on the area, though the disturbances seemed to have stopped. Tucker helped me shore up the property lines, and I noticed he was less uneasy, as if a long-standing tension had dissipated. Eventually, I had to decide whether to sell the land and move on. But each morning, as I walked among the sagebrush, I felt a strange reverence for the place. It wasn't just a haunted patch of dirt. It was history, mine, my ancestors, and the local lore that shaped Bodie. I wanted to honor that, to maybe restore what had once stood here. With the money I'd saved and the small inheritance, I began planning a modest rebuild of the old homestead's foundation, telling Tucker I'd hire him full-time if he was willing. He grinned in relief. "Sure, reckon we've stared down enough nightmares here to claim it as our own now." Sometimes, at sunset, I stand by the old well with the rosary in my pocket, thinking about La Llorona's tortured sobs. I can't say for certain that she's truly gone. Perhaps her spirit still roams the high desert, searching for the children lost in her memory. But I choose to believe that, in driving her away, I offered her a moment of peace. In turn, she forced me to confront my own pain, compelling me to stand my ground and let my mother's love strengthen me, rather than weigh me down. I still hear the wind moan across the sage at night, but it no longer frightens me. The desert has become my home, and its ghosts, though tragic, are part of its tapestry. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that even in desolation, there is a profound connection between the living and the dead, between heartbreak and hope. And sometimes, by facing the darkness head-on, we find the light we need to keep going. My name is Daria Cooper, and I was 33 years old when this happened near the Salton Sea in Southern California. I'd been a high school teacher in Los Angeles for almost a decade, until burnout and anxiety finally drove me to take a sabbatical. I bought a battered old RV on a whim, hoping that traveling off-grid might restore something in me that long hours of lesson plans and crowded classrooms had eroded. I chose the Salton Sea because it was cheap and secluded. No one in LA wanted to vacation in a place infamous for rotting fish, toxic water, and abandoned dream homes. As I drove down the pothole-ridden highway, the desert sun blazed so fiercely I had to keep my AC running at full blast, though it barely made a dent in the heat. Faded billboards advertised marinas and yacht clubs that no longer existed. Rusting mobile homes dotted the roadside, remnants of a 1950s paradise turned environmental disaster. When I finally spotted a broken sign reading Salton Shores Marina, 1 mile, I steered my RV onto a cracked asphalt lane that looked more like a junkyard than an entrance to a once thriving resort. I found a spot to park amid the rubble of old trailers and half-buried boat hulls. Stepping outside was like entering a silent world of dust and stench. I'd read about the fish die-offs, but nothing prepared me for the reek that hit my nostrils. Something bitter and decayed, like an endless tide of rotting fish left baking in the sun. The shoreline stretched out ahead, the water's surface strangely still, reflecting the sky in a murky shimmer. Heat waves distorted the horizon. The first person I met was a man rummaging through a rusted dumpster near the half-collapsed marina building. He stood up, wiping sweat from his brow, and offered a brief nod. "Hey," he called. "You lost?" "Not exactly," I said. "I'm visiting. Are you from around here?" "Name's Manny Alvarez," he replied, setting down a dented can. "I used to fish the lake back when it had fish worth catching. Now I mostly salvage junk to sell. You picking a tough spot for a getaway." "I needed somewhere cheap and quiet," I admitted, trying to sound confident. The truth was that the emptiness unnerved me, but I'd come here to be alone. "Is it safe to camp here overnight?" He shrugged. "Safer than some spots, but we get odd folks passing through. You might want to keep an eye out. And the water's no good, stinks worse at night. Sometimes you hear weird sounds across the flats. Could be coyotes or something else." His tone grew cautious. "Just be careful." I thanked him for the advice, then maneuvered my RV closer to the water, parking on cracked earth that felt stable enough. The air smelled increasingly foul as I stepped out to set up camp chairs and a small grill. Waves of heat shimmered off the lake's surface, dotted with floating fish carcasses. I tried not to look too closely at them, nor think about what sort of toxins lurked in that water. The afternoon passed slowly. I read a worn novel and tried to ignore the pungent odor. Just as the sun began to set, a battered van rolled up nearby. A woman hopped out, her hair in messy braids. She introduced herself as Summer Gaines, apparently living on the road as well. She told me she'd been camped closer to Slab City but decided to come here to salvage items near the old marina. She had a strange, restless energy. "You'll think I'm nuts," she said, rummaging in a box of old bottles she'd found. "But there are rumors of a lake demon or siren around here. My buddies in Slab City told me the locals see a pale figure at night, luring folks to the shoreline. I've heard weird calls after midnight. Could be the wind, but it spooked me enough that I almost left for good." Summer's eyes sparkled with both curiosity and fear. I forced a laugh. "I'm sure it's just desert legends," I said, though I'd already felt that twinge of disquiet. Manny's caution echoed in my mind. That night, the temperature plunged, as deserts often do. I settled into my RV, feeling the day's exhaustion in my bones. I drifted into a restless sleep, only to be awakened by a soft, undulating sound. I sat up in my bunk, pulse thudding, and pressed my ear to the window. The noise sounded like distant moaning, maybe wind across the desolate flats. Glancing at my phone, I saw it was just past 2 a.m. Reluctantly, I tried to sleep again, hugging my pillow tight. By dawn, I woke to a stench so overpowering that I gagged stepping outside. Littered around my RV was a semicircle of dead tilapia, all rotting in the sun. Their eyes bulged, and flies buzzed around them. An uneasy knot twisted in my stomach. Did the tide push them up here, or had someone or something placed them around my campsite as a sick joke? I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Manny approached, grimacing as he saw the fish. "That's no normal tide pattern," he muttered, nudging one corpse with his boot. "You see or hear anything last night?" "I heard moaning," I admitted. like someone crying out in the dark. Manny grimaced. Some folks say it's a spirit or a siren. I don't know about that, but it's definitely strange out here. If it keeps up, maybe you should move on. This place does things to people's heads. I nodded, unsettled. But I'd come here to face my own demons, or so I told myself. I started clearing the fish, gagging from the odor. Manny helped, though his stoic expression betrayed worry. Flies swarmed in thick clouds, and my stomach churned. Later that day, I decided to visit the local sheriff's substation for my own peace of mind. The tiny building was a few miles down a dusty road. Inside, I found Deputy Andrea Flores, leaning on a desk covered in missing person posters and old case files. When I described the fish around my RV, plus the weird nighttime call, she frowned. "Any sign of trespassers? Tracks?" she asked. I shrugged. All I'd found were strange footprints near the water, barefoot impressions that seemed part human, part distorted by the salt-crusted mud. Deputy Flores glanced at her files. "We've had scattered reports of unusual stuff, vandalism, missing drifters, but never any solid evidence. If you feel unsafe, you should leave. The Salton Sea isn't exactly tourist-friendly these days." I returned to my RV more uneasy than before. Meanwhile, Summer's van still parked upshore. I walked over, wanting to swap stories, but I found it empty, the driver's door wide open and scattered belongings inside. A pair of footprints led from her van to the lake's edge. The wind had partially obliterated them, but I could see enough to guess she'd gone out there barefoot. I called her name. No answer. The shoreline stretched, dotted with fish bones. My heart rate spiked. Summer was nowhere in sight. I rummaged through her van for some clue. An open notebook mentioned haunting calls and pull from the water, plus a half-finished drawing of a gaunt figure with algae dripping from its limbs. The last entry simply read, "Going to see if it's real. Don't let me vanish too." A chill rippled through me. I locked her van, then hurried to Manny's usual salvage spot. He listened, jaw tightening. "We gotta tell the deputy," he said. "But half the time, folks vanish out here because they're transients. She might have just moved on. Or maybe not." We reported Summer's disappearance to Deputy Flores, who promised a quick search but made no guarantees. "These things happen," she said grimly. "I'll do what I can." That night, I stayed wide awake with the curtains drawn. My anxiety twisted my stomach into knots. Sometime near midnight, the moaning began again, more pronounced and melodic this time, like a warped lullaby drifting across the flats. Despite every logical bone in my body telling me to stay put, I felt an urge to open the door, to follow that haunting tune. My heart hammered. I forced myself to remain inside, hugging my knees in the dim light of my lantern. At dawn, Manny knocked on my RV door. He looked uneasy. "I found footprints near the shore," he said. "Odd, like they got web patches or something." He showed me pictures on his phone, partial prints in the slimy sand leading into deeper water. I squinted at the images, a cold wave coursing through me. "This is insane," I whispered. "We need more help out here. We can't just let people disappear." But Manny shook his head. "Deputy Flores is spread thin. Honestly, people won't believe us until there's cold, hard proof." He paused, then offered an idea. "I have a small aluminum boat. We can set up a camera at night, see if we catch something on film." My instincts screamed, "Don't get in that water." But I agreed. If there was a chance to find out what happened to Summer, if she was alive or not, I had to try. That evening, Manny and I launched his rickety boat a few dozen yards from shore. The stench was overwhelming, but we persevered. Under the last light of day, we rigged a waterproof camera on the hull, pointed outward. Then we retreated to our respective vehicles, determined to retrieve the footage in the morning. By midnight, the moans rose again, warbling, echoing across the lake. Clutching my flashlight, I stared at the black water from my RV window, half expecting to see Summer emerge, calling for help. Instead, I saw movement, something pale and glistening sliding through the shallows near Manny's boat. Fear wrapped icy fingers around my chest. Suddenly, the wind kicked up. My RV rocked. The moaning grew louder, turning into a shriek. Panic seized me and I grabbed my phone to call Manny. No signal, typical. Summoning courage, I yanked open the door and stumbled out onto the salt-crusted ground. Sand whipped at my ankles. Manny was outside too, shining a flashlight at the water. "What is that?" I yelled over the gusts. "Keep back," he shouted, voice trembling. His beam caught a glimpse of something in the lake. A figure half submerged, hair streaming like kelp, features masked by shadow. It let out a keening cry that rattled my teeth. I gasped, stepping back. Manny fired a flare gun he'd been carrying. The red light arced over the water, briefly illuminating the creature. Waterlogged flesh clung to a lithe body, arms too long, fingers splayed like fins. Then, with a splash, it vanished beneath the surface. The moaning ceased as if switched off. Silence enveloped the night. Heart pounding, I turned to Manny, who looked ashen. "That wasn't human," he whispered, voice shaking. We stared at each other, neither willing to state the obvious. We might be dealing with something that defied logic. We waited, adrenaline surging, but no further sign of the creature emerged. Eventually, Manny walked me back to my RV. He said he'd call Deputy Flores in the morning. I spent the rest of the night dozing fitfully, images of that half-glimpsed figure looping through my head. At dawn, Manny and I ventured out to retrieve the camera from the boat. As we approached, we saw the craft listing to one side, large scratches gouged into the aluminum hull. Manny cursed under his breath. We found the camera, battered but intact. We played the footage on his phone. The screen shook with each wave. For a minute, nothing. Then a pale shape slid in front of the lens, too close to identify clearly. The camera shook wildly, capturing glimpses of something's face. Sunken eyes, gaping mouth, strands of hair or seaweed trailing. I covered my mouth, fighting nausea. "We have to show this to the deputy," I whispered, voice shaking. Manny nodded. We rushed to Deputy Flores' station, anxious. She watched the footage with a stoic expression but eventually let out a shaky breath. "If this is real, we have a major situation. People are missing, and now this. I'll notify my superiors. In the meantime, you two should stay away from the water." We left the station unsettled. Manny suggested we gather any gear we had. Flares, rope, anything that might protect us. I just wanted to flee, but my RV had started having mechanical issues and the local repair guy was out of town. Manny offered me a ride in his truck if needed, but I didn't want to abandon the only home I had. So I stayed. Foolish or brave, I couldn't decide. That night, a thunderstorm rumbled in the distance. The sky glowed intermittently with lightning. I paced inside the RV, ready to peel out if the creature appeared. A loud crash outside startled me. Stepping out, I found Manny pinned to the ground near the water's edge, arms flailing. The creature was on him, half out of the lake, emitting a wet, gurgling roar. Manny screamed as it dragged him by the shoulders. Without thinking, I sprinted forward, adrenaline surging. "Let go of him," I shouted, snatching up a metal rod from the ground. I swung it at the creature's back. Its skin was slick, clammy under my grip, and it reeked of brine and decay. It snarled at me with blackened teeth, eyes milky. Manny kicked at its midsection, earning a guttural hiss. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark white. My next swing struck the creature's shoulder. It shrieked, then released Manny to swipe at me. I barely dodged, nearly slipping on the muck. "Run!" Manny gasped, lurching to his feet. But I couldn't leave him behind. We staggered backward together. The creature advanced, arms outstretched, a keening wail escaping its throat. Suddenly, a spotlight beam pierced the darkness. Deputy Flores's SUV screeched to a stop. She leapt out, shotgun in hand, firing a warning shot overhead. The creature flinched from the muzzle flare, then darted back into the water with shocking speed, leaving ripples on the black surface. We collapsed, shaking. Deputy Flores rushed over, wide-eyed. "Are you two okay?" I was patrolling when I saw movement. Manny was breathing hard, sporting a bleeding scrape across his chest. I was scraped and bruised, my heart threatening to bust out of my ribcage. The next hours were a blur. Deputy Flores bandaged Manny's wounds. We all agreed that staying was too risky. Manny planned to drive out with me following in my RV. Except my RV wouldn't start. Something had torn wires in the engine compartment. A sabotage or just freak damage? I wanted to cry with frustration. Manny insisted I ride with him, but I balked at leaving my RV behind. I'd poured what little savings I had into it. A compromise formed. Manny and the deputy would help me attempt emergency repairs at dawn. For now, we'd stay together. Guns and flares at the ready. We huddled in Manny's truck, engine running, headlights facing the lake. The hours passed in tense silence. Lightning flickered. Thunder rolled in the distance. Once, we heard a scraping sound near the shoreline, but it faded. By morning, the storm had moved on. The horizon glowed pink. Manny checked my RV's engine, managed to jury-rig something so it would run. Deputy Flores escorted us down the potholed road toward the main highway. None of us had illusions we'd be safe if the creature followed. But the fresh daylight offered a shred of hope. I glanced in my rearview mirror often, half expecting to see a pallid shape crawling after us in a swirl of dust. We never found Summer. Her van remained deserted. Manny suspected the creature claimed her. Deputy Flores filed a formal missing person report, but with so few leads, it might stay unsolved. As for me, I left that tortured lake behind, my nerves frayed, my nightmares newly stocked with visions of a waterlogged siren prowling stinking shores. I holed up in a small RV park miles away, still haunted by the memory of that wet grip, those sunken eyes gleaming in the flare's light. Officially, the sheriff's office labeled the sightings unsubstantiated, though we left the camera footage with them. Manny, pragmatic as ever, told me he was done salvaging around the Saltan Sea. "Some places just aren't worth it," he said quietly. "That lake wants to be left alone." I still can't fully process what I experienced. Sometimes I dream of shimmering water at night, seeing a ghostly figure beckoning me closer, hearing that low, mournful moan. I wake gasping, relieved to be far from that toxic shoreline. Yet a part of me still wonders if the Saltan siren was truly some supernatural beast, or just an embodiment of the area's tragedy, a manifestation of all that's rotten under the surface. But when I remember Manny's screams, the stench, the scratches across my RV, I can't doubt my own terror. Whatever it was, it reminded me that nature, even in its decaying man-made corners, holds mysteries that defy simple explanation. And that sometimes the line between nightmare and reality is thinner than we dare admit. In the end, I found no solace by the Saltan Sea. Only more reasons to question what dark secrets lurk beneath still waters, and to appreciate the fragile safety we cling to on land. If you ever consider camping there, be warned. The place is as haunting as the rumors suggest. And when night falls, no breeze can hide the hush that descends, nor the distant echoes of something that might be calling your name.